Welcome to the Animal Training Fundamentals Podcast, where we have fun with practical application and we get mental with the science of behavior. Put them both together and you get results, solutions for your behavior problems, and the tools you need to achieve your training goals. I'm your host, Barbara Heidenreich. Let's talk training. What's up, Force-Free family? Barbara here, and I want to talk about one of my favorite topics. I want to talk about non-food reinforcers. Now, first of all, we need to talk about what exactly is reinforcer. Now, we typically think about reinforcers as that consequence that's going to happen after an animal does a behavior. And one of the things that tends to happen when people talk about these things is we tend to refer to anything like food or, if we're going to give a little scratch to the animal, we always tend to call that the reinforcer. But one thing to keep in mind is that something like that is only a reinforcer if it increases behavior. Otherwise, prior to that, it's just a desired item or experience. So one of the things I want to be really careful about is when we're talking about animal training, you don't want to say reinforcer when you're just talking about food, right? We don't know that it's a reinforcer until it actually has influenced behavior. So be careful about that when you're using your language out there. Now, the other thing that you'll notice is that I'm saying non-food reinforcer instead of primary or secondary. So if you're kind of a behavior nerd out there, you've probably heard the terms primary reinforcer and secondary reinforcer. Those of you that know me well know that I'm really into practical application. I really try to be user-friendly, and I definitely listen to the science and I talk science and all that kind of fun stuff. But I try to use terminology that is also user-friendly. One of the challenges with using words primary and secondary is that it gets a little fuzzy. Some of the things that we consider secondary reinforcers sometimes also kind of drift over into the land of primary reinforcers. So typically we talk about primary reinforcers are things that the animal doesn't have to have any learned association for the item that you're offering or experience that you're offering to have reinforcing value. So secondaries are things that we would say the animal learns by association typically. But there are some things that kind of fall in the gray area. So just to get away from all that and get right down to practical application and not have to get all argumentative about, is this a primary reinforcer or is this a secondary reinforcer? I make it easy on myself and easy on the people I work with. Let's just say food and non-food reinforcers. And then there's no questions. It just gets a whole lot easier for everybody. So that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about everything other than food. We know that food can work really well for a lot of animals. For some animals, it doesn't work so well. And that's okay, because guess what? We have a lot of things that are not food that work really, really well for animals. And that's what I want to talk about today. So using food is fine if it's a thing that works for that animal. But there are definitely situations in which non-food reinforcers are wonderful, and we should definitely take advantage of that. So one thing to keep in mind is that definitely there are situations in which an animal might not be interested in food. And especially those of you that work with animals that don't eat every single day, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And so those animals are probably not going to be interested in food. And so we're going to be looking at other ways to get them interested in doing behavior. And sometimes things that are not food are even more interesting to animals than food reinforcers. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that in just a moment. The other thing that's really important about using other items besides food to reinforce behavior is that we get more variety. And this really comes in handy when we've got behaviors that are in maintenance mode, meaning that we are doing that behavior every single day, especially in the zoological community where we are training animals to do behaviors every single day just to make day-to-day care easier. Like, say, for example, shifting from one area to another area. We might be having animals that load into transport containers or get on scales every day. And so those behaviors may be happening so frequently that it becomes very predictable. And if the same item is offered every single time, the animal knows exactly what's going to happen. And they are very good at going, oh, I know what I'm going to get. I'm going to get that same thing I get every single day. And they can make a decision saying, you know what, it's not worth it for me today. But if we start using variety of reinforcers in those situations, we can increase motivation for the animal to do that behavior because they never know what they're going to get. So it's a really great strategy for us, and that's a great place to incorporate your non-food reinforcers. All right, so now we're going to dive in a little bit deeper. Let's explore some of those categories. What are some types of non-food reinforcers out there that you may not have thought about? So I'm going to talk about a few examples that I've used in my animal training out there all around the world. One of my favorite ones, and this is an example from an animal training workshop we did here in my part of the world, out here in Texas. We used scent as a reinforcer to train a guinea pig, or I did, I should say. This was an awesome experience. So we had an animal training workshop for professionals that we wanted it to be much more practical application focused, more hands-on, and we had a variety of animals here. And one group of animals we had was guinea pigs, and these guinea pigs all came from a rescue sanctuary type situation, and they came to our facility and they hung out for a few days to get habituated to the environment. But some of them were not that interested in food, which is absolutely shocking to me for guinea pigs, because usually they'll just eat everything and anything that you give to them that's healthy for guinea pigs. But we had this one little guinea pig named Ned, and he was an intact male, and he absolutely had zero interest in food, but boy, did he love the ladies. And we had female guinea pigs in another enclosure nearby. And what I did is I took a handful of soiled litter from the enclosure where the females were, and that little Ned went nuts for the smell of soiled litter from a female guinea pig enclosure. So really all I had to do to get him to do behavior was let him take a whiff of the soiled litter in my hand. It was just fantastic. So I had that little guy targeting all over the place just for the opportunity to stick his nose into my handful of soiled litter. And I hate to say it, but it was like crack cocaine for him. So never underestimate the power of smell and sexual attraction, I guess, for guinea pigs. But it's not just for guinea pigs. So another great example that was shared with me at San Antonio Zoo was how they get their cobra to shift. So when working with venomous reptiles, one strategy that's typically been seen is to use snake hooks and things like that, and manipulate them physically to move them around. But I love this approach that was used at that zoo. They took water that frozen chicks had been soaked in to thaw them out to feed their animals. And they took that water and they put it in a spray bottle, and they have a darkened box that's attached to the exhibit where the cobra lives, and they sprayed the inside of the box with the water that the chick had been soaked in. And so what would happen is the cobra would smell that and would start going into that box, and so once the animal would go into the box, they could close the door, and now the animal's in there and they could service the exhibit area. But after they started doing that over and over again, that was a way to get the action started. Then what they could do is they could start pairing a signal that meant that scent was going to be available in there. And so then they turned it into a cued behavior. So it'd be kind of knock, 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 you shift and you'll have access to that scent there. So I thought that was a really clever use of scent. And then I've also used it myself when we were trying to address a situation with a snake, or woma, which is an Australian species. It was a young snake who was rather exploratory, and he was going to be used for education programs. And what would happen is as he was kind of, sliding along on somebody's hand, his body position would change and he would kind of arch his head up a little bit, and get into a position, sort of a precursor to an exploratory bite. And we knew it was not an aggressive behavior based on his body language. He would kind of do a little tiny bite and let go, as opposed to I'm biting you and wrapping around and squeezing down tight or anything like that. And again, something the keepers associated with his young age and kind of checking out his environment. We had a lot of tongue flicking, definitely exploring his environment. And what we noticed is if his body was flat as he was sliding along, he would do a lot more tongue flicking, like, oh, I'm really checking out the environment. So based on his body language, we felt it was really enriching to him and interesting to him to explore and crawl along on the keeper. And we saw it change as he got onto different fabrics, and, skin was less interesting than the smell of the sweatshirt, things like that. So the way we looked at it is, as long as his body was flat, he could continue exploring and gather all those scents that he was gathering. If we saw his body kind of arching up like a precursor to that bite, we would just kind of very gently move him farther away from any interesting smells. So basically, we're using a little bit of negative punishment. You lose the opportunity to have access to those fabulous smells whenever your body gets into this arching position. But as long as your body stays flat, you have the opportunity to keep collecting all those wonderful smells. So we were definitely using scent as a way to influence behavior and using our operant conditioning principles there. So there's just a few examples of using scent to influence your animal behavior. Now let's move on to another favorite, often a favorite of the humans as well. I'm talking tactile. How many of us love to touch animals? I know I do, ever since I was a little kid. But tactile can be used to train animals as well. A great example is with one of my favorite zoos, Santa Barbara Zoo. I work with them quite a bit. They've done some great training with their guinea hogs, and a lot of people who work with any kind of pigs know that many of them love being scratched and having their bellies rubbed. And not all of them, but a lot of them do. And often you can get them to lay down by rubbing their bellies. But when we do certain behaviors, we don't really want the animal just to be distracted by having their belly rub. What we really want to do is deliver that belly rub or that scratch as a consequence for participating in behavior or allowing something to occur. So one of the trainers at Santa Barbara Zoo used that strategy to train for injections. And so the guinea hogs there will lay down when you rub their belly, but after they're down, what she does is she gives a scratch for allowing the injection to occur. And obviously she trained all that with nice little baby steps, but they have learned that the injection must occur first in order for you to get your belly rub. So I love that. And we have been talking about reptiles a little bit, but keep in mind that also some of our larger tortoises like the Galapagos and the Aldabras, and I've also seen some of the spur-thighed tortoises, the sulcatas, respond to touch on their necks in a way that indicates that they like it. They'll stretch their necks out really far. So certainly the Galapagos and the Aldabras have the finching behavior where, in the wild, the birds will pick off little insects and things off of their necks. And so the tortoises will stretch their necks up really far so that you can rub on their necks there, and we can take advantage of that as a reinforcer as well. And we can use it to help us get them into positions, just like I mentioned with the guinea hogs there. So we can use it two different ways. One, to help get the position we want, get the action we want, and then we can also start delivering it as a reinforcer. So there have been some of those larger tortoises that have been trained for voluntary blood draws in that, using that technique. And then other tortoises really like having the backs of their shells rubbed. And so you can take advantage of that as well. Tactile, of course, is a great favorite of many rhinos, those of you that work with rhinos. And so we've used that for sure as a reinforcer for different behaviors. And same thing as I mentioned with the guinea hogs and the tortoises, we've also used that to help get them in great position. So in one of the zoos that I work with in Ireland, we use that to help get back feet into a good position so that we could work on foot care on the back feet. And so a little bit of scratching on the inside of the leg, a big favorite for many rhinos, helped to lift the leg and get it in a good position. But then we can also deliver scratching as a reinforcer, and food too. Many of those guys will respond well to food as well. So tactile, a wonderful option for quite a few different animals. Moving on to another category, how about auditory? Not too many people think about this one, but I am going to give you a wonderful example of how auditory does influence behavior. Now, this one is not one of those desired behaviors, but it absolutely happens, because I just want you guys to think about how we reinforce behavior using non-food reinforcers. And that example is parrots vocalizing for attention. Now, parrots, for those of you that aren't familiar with them, they bond super strongly to most parrot species, I should say. Most parrot species bond really strongly to another individual out in the wild, and that can happen with a human in when they're hanging out with people, or if they've been raised by people. And when they get separated from people, their inclination, or their I should say, when they get separated from their preferred person, or other bird, they'll vocalize to find out where that other individual is. And what happens is if somebody responds to that, whether it's intentional with shut up or be quiet or shh, talk in a quiet voice, please, or hello, or whatever they say back, or even if it's unintentional, like they just happen to make a noise in the other room, they're moving something around and the bird hears that sound and takes it as they're over there, that can reinforce the vocalizing and teach the bird that that's exactly what you need to do to get a response out of that individual. So whatever that bird hears in response to their vocalization lets them know that screaming is the way to get a desired response. So an auditory response to that vocalizing for attention absolutely reinforces that behavior. So there you go. It does work even for bad behavior, or I should say undesired behavior. All right, let's talk about another one. How about visual reinforcers? A lot of people don't think about this, but absolutely visual reinforcers exist as well. So a really fun example I'd like to share is using a mirror to reinforce gibbons. And this one occurred when I was consulting, again, with Santa Barbara Zoo. We were trying to get a gibbon to shift from outside into an inside area where we wanted to do some training for medical behaviors. And the gibbon we wanted to work with was kind of hanging out by this door that happened to have like a little window in it. And he was looking at his reflection in the window. And we were trying to use food to get him to shift in. And the keeper that I was working with was telling me some information that she had read in a journal article about gibbons liking to look at themselves in the mirror. And here we were looking at this guy looking at himself in this reflection. And I was like, oh, well, of course, we should go get a mirror. And so I ran up to the apartment that I was staying in at the zoo and grabbed a mirror that I had with me. And sure enough, he came right in to go look at himself in the mirror. And then we also moved on to using other reinforcers as well. But we ended up incorporating that as one of our tools in our toolkit for reinforcing gibbons from then on in. I've also used just looking at an animal, sort of a social reinforcer with my own blue-throated macaw. Those of you that work with macaws know that they do a lot of things with their head and their body posture and sort of mimicking body postures with each other. And they'll do that with people as well. So that has worked as a reinforcer in my situation. So my blue-throated macaw, the specific example I'd like to share is she was sitting on top of a transport cage that I have kind of resting on a countertop. And that was behind me. And she's flighted. And my Amazon was sitting on the sink and he's flighted. And I was spraying him with a spray bottle. It was wintertime and I was trying to give him a bath. And she wanted to fly towards him and kind of push him out of the way so that she could have all the attention. And he was busy engaged in his bath and didn't want to be bothered with her. So for me to kind of focus on both of them meant that I needed to reinforce her for staying in her spot and also spray him with a spray bottle. But I was kind of far away from her, so it wasn't easy for me to like go over and give her a treat or anything like that. So literally all I did was I turned and I looked at her. And I would kind of open my eyes wide and I would kind of turn my head side to side the way that macaws do towards each other, if you know anything about macaw behavior. And she literally would just stand up tall and her eyes would get wide and her face would flush and she would get so excited that I looked at her. And for her, that social reinforcer was enough for her to go, oh, she looked at me, I'm going to stay right here. You know, that was reinforcing for her enough that I gave her that kind of attention. So I basically did that periodically while I was giving my other bird a bath. And that reinforced the behavior of stationing on top of the crate up there. So it doesn't have to be run over and give her a treat every time. It just depends on what it is your bird is seeking or your animal is seeking as a reinforcer. And that was enough of a reinforcer for her to stay in there. Now, another favorite example of mine is one that you may have seen online. And if not, I am going to provide you a link so that you can go look at it. It has to do with orangutans in Melbourne Zoo and some very cool technology out there by Microsoft Connect, and it involves a 3D sensor. It's really cool stuff. So what they do is they project an image that goes into the habitat of the orangutans, but it also is in the space where people are. And the orangutans can touch the image, and then a guest or a keeper can touch another aspect of the image, and together they can make the image do things. And so it creates these visual, so it's a cool thing. It's a combination of touching and visual, to be quite honest. And so it creates all sorts of cool visual things. And the orangutans can interact with it solo, but it can also be interacted with more than the orangutans. It can be used with the keeper and the guests, as I was mentioning. So it's a really exciting opportunity for enrichment and training, and the animals causing things to happen by interacting with these cool images. So it's so hard to explain, I'm afraid. You really just have to look at the video, but I'll provide you a link to the video so you can see it. And it's just fascinating stuff. But again, very much about visual stuff. And again, it reinforces behavior. Basically, the animal has to do something in order for some kind of consequence to happen. That is a visual consequence. So it's really fantastic stuff. All right, let's look at another one. So another one is enrichment items. And I definitely take advantage of using enrichment items, or if you want to call them toys, whatever you want to call them, to reinforce behavior. So a great example in the parrot world, of course, is that you can deliver a toy whenever a bird does something that you want. One of my favorite video clips that I have from a workshop that I taught at a place called Cockatoo Downs up in Oregon was training a little young African gray parrot to step up onto the hand. This African gray parrot was not very interested in food items. It was kind of on an all-seed diet at the time, and even though it was a young parrot, and it was already showing a fear response to hands. And so we needed to break down stepping up onto the hand into tiny approximations. And I kind of have my own little technique how I do this. It involves putting my hand at the end of the perch and letting the bird sidestep onto the hand so I can break it down into really small approximations. And then what we did is we offered a toy for each, a small foot toy basically, for each step towards my hand. And the problem with using with toys with a parrot is they have to give it up, right? And so you kind of have to wait for them to finish playing with that small item. And there's some strategies I have for getting him to move on to the next object and things like that. So it doesn't take 3 hours to get to your next approximation. But it worked really well. And so what we ended up getting is a bird getting all the way onto the hand just using these small toys. And it was super successful. And that bird went on to be a superstar, I have to admit. And another really great example for me was working with an orangutan in Indonesia, where and in this particular situation, it was a younger animal. We were working in a free contact situation. And the challenge with her was that she wouldn't really stick around with the people that were working with her. But if you were to watch her, the reason she wasn't sticking around was that everything else out in the environment was a lot more fun. This was an animal this is that classic example of just giving an animal food really isn't enough to keep them doing the behaviors you want. If you were to watch your animal, what you see is that she wants to engage with the environment. And that's what I saw, is that everything out there was fun and novel and interesting. And what was happening with the team was kind of the same old thing, same old thing she does every day. And she was kind of over it. And so what I started doing was every day that I would come by, I would bring just a stash of things that I had collected from my accommodations that I thought were orangutan safe. So I brought like toilet paper, and they had like, toothbrushes that they gave the guests in the hotel room there. And we would collect cardboard boxes and everything we could think of. And so when we would ask her to, come station someplace, I would just have the team hand her a new object to play with. And the thing to keep in mind when you're using things like enrichment items, the novelty part is really, really important. So when you think about using food, let's say you were training lemurs or something, you might keep giving pieces of grape over and over again until they get satiated and then your training session is done. The thing with enrichment items is you can't keep giving the same item over and over and over again, because what tends to happen is the novelty wears off and the animal loses interest in it. But if you have a nice variety of items to offer, your session can go on for quite a period of time, because you've always bringing in something new into the situation and the animal's going, oh, that's interesting. I'd like to play with that. Oh, that's different. And I'll play with that now. And so that's the really important part. And a lot of times trainers are not quite prepared to have a huge stash of different things available to them. So that's one of the things you have to really get prepared for if you're going to use enrichment items to train. So that was a really fun session, and it worked out really well to have all those enrichment items. We also ended up using a whole bunch of towels with her. She, as those of you that work with orangutans know, they like throwing towels and blankets and burlap sacks over their heads and things like that. And so that also worked out really well for her as well. Okay, let's look at another one. So how about activity? If you're a bit of a science geek, you probably know something about Premack. So the Smarty Pants know about Premack's principle. So I'm going to introduce this a little bit. It can get really complex, but basically think about it as using another behavior to reinforce a behavior. So a classic example is, let's say you are one of those people that takes your dog for a walk, and you would like your dog to sit nice and calmly and allow you to put the leash on him before you're going to open the door and let him go for that walk. So that would be using that opportunity to go for a walk to reinforce the behavior of sitting calmly and letting you put the leash on him. And another thing that I think about, like in the zoo world, is we have animals that anticipate doors being opened for shifting inside because maybe there's a meal waiting for them, and when we don't really like them walking back and forth waiting for the door to open. So you may ask them to do something else, like target or station, and if they do that behavior, then the door will be open and they get to shift inside, and that's another behavior that they're going to do, and then they get to eat inside there. So we can do that as well. I have another one that I want to share with you. Another wonderful reinforcer for many animals is sex, I have to say. And this is where I like to say non-food versus secondary reinforcers, because sex is one of those ones that kind of falls into that gray area. So a lot of you who already know me and know my background have probably heard me talk about Sirocco. Sirocco is a kakapo, which is a rare nocturnal flightless parrot in New Zealand. And I was very fortunate some years ago to work with Sirocco because he had a little problem with sex. His problem is that he was mating with people's heads. And it's kind of a long story, and I'll tell you where you can find more information on that in just a minute here. But the gist of it is that mating with people's heads is not a natural behavior. It was a learned behavior, and even though it was a funny video that came out about him doing that, and it went viral, and it brought the Kakapo Recovery Program a lot of attention, which was great. It was also a problematic behavior because he was relentless. He's kind of aggressive about it. So they did need the problem addressed. And one of the things we did was we taught him to target and station and do some other behaviors for food reinforcers so that he had some behaviors in his repertoire. And then when we saw the precursors to wanting to mate with somebody's head, we could redirect him to those behaviors. But then what we did is we transferred sex to another object, because mating with people's heads was learned. So he could certainly learn to mate with a different object. So we actually transferred sex to a shoe, believe it or not. And so when we saw those precursors to aggressive behavior, we cued him for the correct behavior, which was targeting or stationing. And then we gave him the opportunity to mate with the shoe, which he did. And so sex was the reinforcer. It wasn't about food or anything like that, because in those moments he wanted sex. So that's what he got. So sex can be a good reinforcer, but of course you want it to be under the right circumstances there. A lot of people always ask, why did you teach a shoe and not with a female kakapo? And that's because he's not genetically significant to the program at this moment. So it was more important for him to be an animal ambassador as opposed to being part of the breeding program at the time. So, but there's a lot more to the story. So, and actually with the place where you can find that is you can actually get all the science. I wrote a nice long professional article about it that was presented at conferences, and you can see all the videos and all that fun stuff in my online education program at animaltrainingfundamentals.com, which you can actually join for just $1 and get 10 days of full access to the entire program. And I'll tell you more where you can find that information. Actually, you can just go to the website, actually, at animaltrainingfundamentals.com, and you can find all that information there. And there'll be links on the podcast page for that as well. Okay, just to recap here a little bit, food can be a great reinforcer. I've got nothing against food, but remember, anything your animal seeks to acquire or engage in and can be delivered contingently has the potential to reinforce behavior. So what you need to do is watch your animal to gather info about what might work as a great reinforcer. Okay, it's time to talk about your training toolbox. These are the new things you learned today you're going to add into your training repertoire and try this week. First of all, you're going to observe your animals, watch what they gravitate towards, what they smell, what they look at, what they rub up against, what do they engage with. Collect as much information as you can. And you're going to use that to develop a list of potential non-food reinforcers. Try to assess their interest in those items to see if they could potentially be used to reinforce behavior. And then see if you can start incorporating some of those to reinforce behavior. Remember, you may not be able to use the same one over and over again like you do with a piece of food. You may need to mix it up if the novelty wears off. All right, there you have it. Those are your assignments for this week. I hope you've enjoyed these training tips. If you want more, remember, for just $1, you get 10 days of full access to animaltrainingfundamentals.com. Pick a membership, enter the code TRY10days, and check it out. Thanks for talking training with me. Let's do it again. If you liked what you heard today, visit animaltrainingfundamentals.com for more quality content on animal training. You'll find courses, community, and extensive video examples from my consulting work around the world. We'd love to have you join our force-free family.